Welcome to West Film, where every movie has a story worth telling. From heart-pounding action to twisty mysteries and dramas that stick with you, we dig into the plot, the characters, and the moments that make each film worth your time. So grab a seat, get comfortable, and let's jump into today's movie. This is West Film, your story starts here. Sicario, Day of the Soldado, a recap and review. Recap: Matt starts pressing Bassa with questions about the Kansas City bombing. Bassa swears he had nothing to do with the enemy men suspected of carrying it out, but Matt isn't buying the denial. He's convinced Bassa knows a lot more than he's letting on. Intelligence already points to Bassa as the man who mapped out the route that let certain individuals travel by sea and eventually slip into Mexico. Matt doesn't much care about the denial itself. What he wants is the name of whoever is bankrolling the operation, and Bassa won't give it up. So Matt shifts tactics. Instead of sticking with a standard interrogation, he drags Bassa's brother into the room and makes the stakes of staying silent very clear. The pressure works. Bassa breaks and tells Matt that the network traces back to Carlos Rey, one of Mexico's most powerful cartel bosses, not just another trafficker, but a man sitting near the top of the country's criminal hierarchy, with the money, manpower, and reach to operate across borders. While Matt chases that lead, we're introduced to a seemingly unrelated character, Miguel, a teenager living near the border who clearly has other priorities besides school. He skips class often and spends most of his time with his cousin Hector, who works for a cartel. Restless and with little direction, Miguel is an easy target, and Hector eventually offers him a way in. The money, status, and thrill outweigh the danger in Miguel's mind, and he starts drifting toward that world. Back in the US, Matt is called into a high-level meeting with James Riley and government official Cynthia Fords to discuss the links between terrorism, human smuggling, and the cartels. Matt's take is blunt: if cartels are helping terrorists cross into the US, they shouldn't be treated as ordinary criminal organizations anymore. They should be treated as terrorists, and fought like it. His proposed strategy is to sow chaos inside Mexico by turning two major cartels, the Matamoros organization and Carlos Reyes, against each other, tricking each side into believing the other struck first so they destroy one another without realizing an outside hand is pulling the strings. The opening move he proposes is extreme: kidnap Isabella Reyes, Carlos Reyes' youngest daughter. Everyone in the room understands how serious that is. This isn't a routine op, and if it goes sideways, the fallout could be enormous. Still, Matt argues drastic action is necessary, and James approves the plan on one condition: no official US Special Forces can be involved. So Matt needs deniable manpower, and turns to a contractor named Troy to build a mercenary team, with the government quietly covering costs. While that team comes together, Matt flies to Bogota to meet Alejandro, one of his most trusted and most lethal operatives, a man with deep roots in Latin America's criminal underworld and very personal stakes in this particular mission. When Matt tells him the target is Carlos Rey, everything changes for Alejandro. Rey is tied to the murder of his family. For Matt, this is strategy. For Alejandro, it's a shot at revenge. Before they can grab Isabella, they need to manufacture the appearance that a cartel war has already started. Alejandro kills one of the Matamoros cartel's lawyers, a deliberate, message-sending execution. He even tells the man to put his glasses on first, so he can clearly see who's about to kill him. News of the murder spreads fast, pulling public attention toward what looks like an escalating cartel conflict. The perfect distraction while Matt's team quietly moves into position for the real target. Isabella, meanwhile, has no idea any of this is happening. She's a difficult, entitled student who knows exactly what her father's name buys her: a protection from consequences that would sink anyone else. When school lets out, she leaves under the watch of her security detail, completely unaware that Matt's operation is already closing in. Matt's team jams communications around her convoy, boxes in her car, and pulls her out before her guards can react, covering her head so she can't see who's taking her. To sell the idea that the rival Matamoros cartel is behind it, Alejandra gets to one of her surviving bodyguards and poses as a Matamoros man, letting that story filter back to Carlos Ray. At the same time, Matt stages a fake shooting near Ray's compound to muddy the waters further while tracking his movements. Alejandro takes Isabella to a hidden location, keeps her disoriented, and then flips the script entirely, presenting himself as an American law enforcement officer supposedly rescuing her from the cartel that took her. With help from local police playing along, the whole thing looks like a legitimate recovery operation. Isabella is questioned and treated like a rescued victim, buying the team time. Before pushing further, Matt and Alejandra meet with a trusted contact, Rafael, because the next phase is riskier still, moving Isabella into territory near Matamoros turf so that if Carlos Ray thinks his daughter is being held there, he'll retaliate and the cartels will go to war. Rafael agrees to help them through the region. On the way out, Matt runs into Miguel in a parking lot, a brief, tense encounter that neither man realizes yet will matter later. Alejandro notices it too. That night, Miguel goes deeper into the cartel with Hector, meeting Gallo, a senior Matamoros figure, who brings him further into the fold. Meanwhile, Matt's team preps to move Isabella. Alejandra gives her a bulletproof vest before they set out. The convoy heads toward Matamoros territory, and Rafael's connections get them through safely at first. But Matt starts sensing something is wrong as the vehicles veer off the agreed route and onto isolated back roads. Then gunfire erupts. Men dressed as Mexican federal police ambush the convoy in a coordinated attack that suggests inside knowledge of their route. In the chaos, Isabella slips away and runs. Matt's team fights back hard, eventually gaining the upper hand and discovering the attackers weren't real police. They were Carlos Ray's men in disguise. With the mission compromised and Isabella missing, Matt sends Alejandro after her with a tracker while he leads the rest of the team back across the border, running into and forcing through another roadblock along the way. Isabella, wandering alone, flags down a passing car, only to discover the driver works for her father. She resists being taken back, and just as things turn physical, Alejandro arrives, takes the man down, and gets her out. By now Isabella knows Alejandro is somehow behind everything, even if she doesn't understand why. Back in the US, Matt clashes with Cynthia. Washington wants their whole operation shut down now that news has broken of Mexican police officers dying in the ambush, and the political fallout is too dangerous. Matt is livid, arguing they were the ones attacked and that walking away now wastes everything they risked. But the decision's already made. The problem, Alejandro and Isabella are still stuck in Mexico. They take shelter with the deaf local man named Angel, who treats them kindly despite everything. Alejandro communicates with him in sign language, one of the few peaceful beats in an otherwise brutal story. Back at the base, Matt, Cynthia, and Steve Fissing regroup. The government's priority has shifted. Isabella isn't just a kidnapped girl anymore. She's a witness who saw too much and is now considered a liability. Cynthia orders Matt's team to find her using the tracker. Matt understands exactly what find her really means if she's recovered alive. Matt starts questioning the orders for the first time. Following through would destroy Alejandro's shot at Carlos Ray and mean sacrificing an innocent girl caught in the middle of an operation she never chose. He's forced to choose, obey and end it, or protect Alejandro and Isabella and defy the people who greenlit the whole thing. While all this unfolds, Isabella gets a brief, quiet moment at Angel's home, sharing a meal and something close to normal life. It doesn't last. Matt reaches Alejandro with a direct order from above. Isabella can't be allowed to live. Alejandro refuses outright. He won't make her another casualty of this operation, and besides, his real target has always been Carlos Ray. Meanwhile, Miguel gets his first real cartel assignment, guiding a group of migrants across the border through difficult terrain to a waiting freight truck. He pulls it off. At the same time, Alejandro preps for a dangerous move of his own, heading toward Carlos Rey with Isabella still by his side. Before they go, Isabella confronts him, revealing she knows exactly who he is and why he hates her father. She's aware of Carlos Rey's connection to the massacre of Alejandro's family. Rather than run from that, she offers to help. Understanding that traveling as Carlos Rey's daughter would draw dangerous attention, she cuts her hair and adopts a new identity, Karina. Before leaving, Alejandro activates the tracker hidden in Isabella's shoe, knowing Matt's team can pick up the signal and hoping he'll come through if things go wrong. Even after refusing his kill order, they head for a migrant crossing point run by the Matamoros cartel, the same smuggling network Miguel now works for. Matt's team, wary of Mexican authorities searching for signs of American involvement, moves in by helicopter to avoid checkpoints. At the crossing point, Alejandro pays Hector for passage, and everything seems to be going smoothly until Miguel spots him and recognizes him from the parking lot encounter. Convinced Alejandro is a cop, Miguel tips off Hector. It's not entirely accurate, but it's enough. Hector plays along at first, then leads them off route into an empty stretch of desert where there are no witnesses. There, the group draws weapons, disarms Alejandro, and pulls Isabella from the vehicle. Alejandro stays calm and tries to talk his way out, telling Gallo that Isabella is Carlos Rey's daughter and that he's acting on Rey's behalf, warning that harming either of them would spark a war that could destroy Matamoros. Gallo doesn't buy it and orders one of his men, Jose, to execute Alejandro. Then, unexpectedly, Gallo shoots Jose himself and hands the gun to Miguel instead, ordering him to finish the job. Miguel, who has never killed anyone, freezes but ultimately fires. Alejandro drops. The cartel members, assuming he's dead, leave him in the desert and take Isabella. Matt, watching from the helicopter via the tracker, sees what looks like Alejandro's execution and is devastated, then furious. He orders his team to pursue Gallo's group, no longer just to recover Isabella but for retaliation. Inside the vehicle, Miguel is shaken, the reality of having, he believes, killed a man finally sinking in. But Alejandro isn't dead. The bullet tore through his cheek rather than hitting anything fatal. Badly wounded, he lies still until the cartel is far enough away, then starts showing signs of life. Matt's helicopter catches up to Gallo's convoy and wipes it out in a fast, overwhelming assault. Isabella survives. Matt, defying Cynthia's order to eliminate her as a security risk, decides instead to put her into witness protection, a clean break from what he was told to do. Back in the desert, Alejandro, badly injured and losing blood, works his bindings loose, commandeers a vehicle abandoned by a dead cartel member, and starts driving. He's ambushed again by Matamoros gunmen along the way but fights them off with a grenade and manages to escape. A year later, Miguel is working an ordinary job at a food stall when Alejandro shows up. The moment instantly brings Miguel back to the night he thought he'd killed him. Rather than seeking revenge, Alejandro, recognizing in Miguel the same path that once defined his own life, offers to train him. The film ends with that unexpected meeting, hinting at where Miguel's story goes from here. Review: making a sequel to Sicario was always going to be a tricky proposition. The first film never felt like it was building toward a franchise that told a complete story, left you sitting with its weight, and that self-contained quality was part of its power. There was nothing manufactured about it. You were simply dragged through an ugly world and left, by the end, understanding just how little control anyone in it actually had. So when Sicario, Day of the Soldado was announced, I was cautiously interested. Benicio del Toro and Josh Brolin were both returning, and Taylor Sheridan was still writing a solid reasons to give it a shot. But Denis Villeneuve wasn't directing, Roger Deakins wasn't shooting it, and Emily Blunt wasn't back. That's a lot of the DNA missing from a sequel trying to continue something so specific. To its credit, Soldado handles that gap better than it probably should. At first glance, it still feels like Sicario, the same recognizable world, the same characters, the same grim, morally compromised atmosphere, the same sense that the people in charge operate several layers beneath whatever version of the law the public believes in. As a continuation, it doesn't betray the original but it does change it in fundamental ways. The first film's power came partly from how contained it felt. Even though a lot was happening, you experienced it through Kate's confusion, information withheld, people who knew more than you did, which gave the whole thing an uneasy, procedural realism, like you'd glimpsed something you weren't meant to see. Day of the Soldado feels more like a production, bigger mission, bigger political stakes, bigger violence, more ambition all around. For some viewers, that's exactly what they wanted: a faster pacing, more screen time for Alejandro and Graver, less time spent slowly building the world through an outsider's eyes. I understand the appeal of that shift, but something is lost in the trade. Alejandro is the clearest example. In the first film, his power came from mystery. You knew he was dangerous long before you understood why, and the film doled out fragments of his story until it all clicked at once. That reveal mattered. Here, we already know who he is, what he's capable of, and why. He's still magnetic. Delta remains fantastic, but you're no longer wondering who this guy is, you're just watching what he'll do next. It's a small shift on paper that changes the character's entire rhythm on screen. The film compensates by making him more emotional and central to the story, which works in places and feels a little off in others, given how much weight the mysterious figure from the first film is now being asked to carry emotionally. That's really the story of Soldado as a whole. It wears the skin of Sicario, but the machinery underneath is different. Where the original was a slow burn thriller with action woven in, this one is an action thriller that still carries some of Sicario's darkness. You get more gunfire, more movement, more characters making direct decisions instead of being pulled through a mystery, and there are stretches where the sequel seems to be trying to prove it can be tougher and more brutal than its predecessor. But being louder doesn't automatically make something more unsettling. That's where the original still wins for me. Its tension often came from restraint, a car slowing down in the wrong place, a quiet conversation, a character just watching. These things could feel more dangerous than anything overtly violent. Soldado still has tension, but it's a more obvious, more telegraphed kind. You can feel it setting the table before the violence arrives, and when it does, it's handled well, just less mysterious. That doesn't mean the film has no identity of its own. Different viewers clearly respond to that shift in opposite ways. Some see a more polished, more conventional film compared to the raw original. Others see a leaner story that trims the slower material and delivers exactly what they wanted. Delta, Brolin, morally compromised government operations, and brutal action. If you found the first film too slow or too opaque, this one will likely feel far more immediately satisfying. It moves fast, gives its returning characters much more room, and doesn't spend much time catching you up. The trade-off is that it's simply easier to read, and Sicario was never really at its best when it was easy to read. The first film constantly made you feel one step behind everyone else. Here, you're standing right alongside the decision makers. You know the plan, the objective, why Alejandro is involved, what Graver wants. So the tension has to come from the plan unraveling rather than from discovering what the plan even is. That's a major shift. The absence of Emily Blunt affects the film more than it might initially seem. Whatever you thought of Kate, she gave the original a point of entry, a normal person's reaction to a world that operated by different rules. Without her, Soldado is living among the wolves from the start. That makes it colder, more interesting in some ways, less emotionally grounded in others. Ultimately, the sequel tries to have it both ways, keeping Alejandro, Graver, the border setting, the brutality, the shadowy government operations, and the dark visual language, while shifting scale, pacing, and perspective. Calling it simply more of the original doesn't quite capture what it's doing. It plays almost like a spin-off centered on the two characters people remembered most. Honestly, I think the film works better if you approach it that way. Going in expecting the exact experience Villeneuve delivered in 2015 will only highlight everything that's missing: the dread, the moral uncertainty, the sense of revelation. Accept that Soldado is doing something more direct within the same world, though, and it becomes a genuinely capable thriller, better than plenty of sequels made for far weaker reasons than a second Sicario. I'm still not convinced the original needed a sequel at all. It worked perfectly well as a standalone story. So Soldado has to earn its existence purely on merit, and for most of its runtime, I think it does. It doesn't deepen the first film in any major way, doesn't force you to reconsider it, doesn't meaningfully expand its legacy, but it doesn't damage it either. It simply drops two great characters into another ugly situation, which might be the healthiest way to view it. Where it stumbles is in occasionally reminding you it wants to be the start of a series. You can feel the franchise building instinct creeping in, especially later on, and it makes certain choices feel less organic than they would in a fully standalone film. The original felt finished. Soldado sometimes feels like a middle chapter, and middle chapters always carry that slightly awkward burden of satisfying the audience while leaving enough loose threads to keep the story moving. Still, I don't think this is a sequel that misunderstands what people loved about the original. It understands the appeal. It just prioritizes different pieces of it. The first film was more precise, more unsettling, more mysterious. This one is bigger, faster, more accessible, more conventional. That leaves it just below the original for me, rather than anywhere close to a failure. It's a worthy follow-up. I'm just not convinced it was a necessary one, and both of those things can be true at once. The setup here is genuinely strong, maybe too strong, since the film spends the rest of its runtime trying to keep control of the idea it opens with. Terrorists are being smuggled across the U.S. Mexico border through cartel-controlled routes, giving the American government justification to treat the cartels as a national security threat rather than ordinary criminals. Since an open war isn't an option, the plan becomes, make the cartels go to war with each other. It's a nasty premise that fits this world perfectly. Graver gets called in because this is exactly his kind of job: deniable, morally filthy, and not meant to raise questions. He brings Alejandro back to help destabilize the cartels from within, and the plan centers on kidnapping Isabella Reyes and framing a rival cartel for it. She isn't the target because anyone cares about her specifically. She's leverage, meant to spark enough confusion and rage to set the cartels against one another. At this stage, the film is genuinely compelling. A cruel logic, but logic nonetheless. The government can't invade Mexico outright, so instead it manufactures chaos and tries to steer it. The problem is how many layers keep getting piled on top of that idea: the terrorism angle, the cartel war, the kidnapping, the fake rescue, the return trip into Mexico, the police betrayal, Alejandro getting separated from the team, Isabella caught in the crossfire, and a running parallel to all of it, a teenage boy being drawn into the smuggling business. Individually, each piece makes sense. Together, the story starts to feel like it's carrying more than it can comfortably hold. That's the central difference from the first film, which was complicated without ever feeling cluttered. You didn't always know what was happening, but the film itself always did. Even when Kate was lost, the story wasn't. Here, it's sometimes unclear whether the confusion is deliberate or if the script is simply juggling too much at once. Sheridan is still excellent at writing hard people in harsh situations. Nobody delivers speeches about good and evil, they talk about objectives and problems that need removing. But structurally, This is a looser film. It keeps threatening to become one big geopolitical thriller before narrowing suddenly into something much more personal. That's not inherently a flaw, as some of the best material comes once the larger operation collapses and the story becomes about Alejandro and Isabella specifically, but the path there is a little clumsy. Opening with cartels smuggling terrorists into the country is an enormous premise, one that could anchor an entire film on its own, but the movie essentially uses it as an ignition switch, and once the operation is underway, the terrorism angle fades in importance. That raises a fair question. Was that opening even necessary? Touching something that politically loaded invites scrutiny, and the film brushes against immigration, Islamic terrorism, cartel violence, border security, black ops government behavior, and child separation without stopping to meaningfully examine any of them. Being present in the story and being examined by it are two very different things, and that gap creates a strange political identity for the film. Depending on how you read it, Soldado can look like several different movies. One version leans into hardline border security anxieties, terrorists entering through Mexico, cartels framed as an enormous threat, the government deciding normal rules no longer apply. Some critics go further, arguing the film reduces both Mexican and Muslim characters to convenient threats, a real concern given how politically loaded this territory already is. But there's another reading, one I find more compelling. The American government here doesn't come off looking responsible at all. It manufactures a conflict, manipulates people, kidnaps a teenager, authorizes violence, and once the operation becomes politically dangerous, the priority shifts from completing the mission to cleaning up the mess. Read that way, the film isn't celebrating American power so much as showing how casually it gets wielded, and how quickly people become disposable once strategy changes. The problem is the film never fully commits to either interpretation. It offers enough material to support the darker reading without making the point unmistakable, which leaves it feeling politically provocative without being politically precise. Maybe that ambiguity is intentional, but there's a meaningful difference between moral ambiguity and simply unclear writing, and the original understood that distinction far better. The cartel war concept is the clearest example of squandered potential. It's a fantastic thriller premise, one side secretly attacking another, staging events so each blames the other, paranoia spreading through both organizations as people scramble to figure out who betrayed whom. But Soldado barely explores that conflict directly. The kidnapping becomes the real center of gravity, the escort mission goes wrong, and the story turns into a survival narrative, meaning the original grand scheme mostly fades into the background. It's a little frustrating, because the setup promises a huge game of manipulation and delivers something far more contained instead. To be fair, I don't dislike the contained version. The film arguably works better once it stops pretending to be massive, but I wish the script had settled on its real focus earlier, because the constant shifts in scale also strain believability. The first film's operation, while significant, felt like something a small group of people might plausibly attempt. Here, Graver's team is trying to engineer a war between major cartels through a terrorism-linked kidnapping, a much bigger swing, and the bigger it gets, the more visible the plot machinery becomes. There are stretches where every single element has to break exactly right for the next beat to happen, which can make the story feel written rather than lived in. The police betrayal sequence is a good example, effective as a set piece, but transparently functioning as the device needed to strand Alejandro and Isabella together. You can feel the screenplay positioning its pieces. The teenage smuggler's subplot has a similar issue. In concept, I like it how watching two totally different levels of the same world unfold side by side, government covert warfare on one hand and a kid earning cash moving people across the border on the other. Sheridan likes that kind of disconnected subplot structure, and when it lands, it can make a story feel much bigger than its central characters. Here, though, The connection feels a bit too convenient, particularly the moment Miguel identifies someone under conditions that don't fully hold up. It's a small detail, but small details matter in a film like this, because the original trained its audience to notice them. Once the realism cracks even slightly, it's more noticeable than it would be in an ordinary action movie. If this were simply a standalone border thriller without the Sicario name attached, a lot of that plotting would be easier to forgive as standard genre convention: people meeting at convenient moments, plans collapsing at the worst time, characters surviving things they probably shouldn't. But carrying the Sicario name invites a higher bar for discipline, and the film seems aware of that tension itself, constantly trying to preserve a grounded, serious tone even as the plot mechanics occasionally strain credibility. None of this makes the script a disaster, though far from it. Plenty of viewers find the film completely gripping, and it's easy to see why. The plot keeps moving, there are enough twists to sustain interest, the stakes are clear, and once Alejandro and Isabel are isolated together, the story becomes much easier to invest in emotionally. Sheridan writes men like Graver and Alejandro extremely well. Their dialogue has a hardness that never feels forced, they rarely over-explain themselves, and some of the best character beats come specifically from the moral impossibility of their positions. That's where the film finds its strongest material, not in the terrorism setup, not really even in the cartel strategy, but in the moment the people executing the plan become inconvenience to the people who approved it. That's cynical, believable, and effective. The government creates the mess, then decides the mess itself needs to disappear. At that point, the political story and the character story finally merge into one question: who gets sacrificed so the people above them never have to answer for what happened? That idea doesn't need a speech to land. You simply watch the system's priorities shift, and it's genuinely ugly to witness. This is where Soldado gets closest to the moral bite of the original. The difference is that the first film built its entire structure around these questions, while this one arrives at them after a much longer, messier detour. So overall, the screenplay is a mix of strong ideas and execution that occasionally gets away from itself. A clever central operation, strong characters, effective government, cynicism, real tension once the mission collapses, undercut by an underdeveloped terrorism angle, muddled political messaging, a hard-to-believe larger operation, a sometimes forced teenage subplot, and constant tonal whiplash between different kinds of movie. What ultimately saves it is that the smaller, more personal story it eventually settles into is more compelling than the sprawling one it opens with. Once the grand strategy collapses, you're left with real people, a girl who was supposed to be a pawn, an assassin who was supposed to be a tool, an agent who was supposed to follow orders, and a government suddenly treating all of them as problems to be solved. That's the film I wish Soldado had trusted from the start, because when it gets there, it genuinely works. The character's one of the sequel's biggest shifts is also one of the easiest to overlook at first. Emily Blunt's absence isn't just the loss of a returning actor, it fundamentally changes the film's moral balance. Kate served a specific function in the original. She was our entry point into this world, someone who didn't understand the rules and reacted honestly whenever a line got crossed. Whether or not you found her frustrating, she gave the film a human response to everything happening around her, questioning Graver, fearing Alejandro, pushing back when law enforcement started looking like something entirely outside the law. Without her, Soldado is populated almost entirely by people who already understand and accept how ugly this world is. Nobody needs anything explained, which means the audience isn't being led into the darkness, we're already standing in it. That's a major shift, and it's likely where opinions on the sequel will split hardest. Viewers who found Kate an obstacle, someone slowing things down or standing between them and Alejandro, will probably see this as a gift. Alejandro and Graver front and center, with no one pausing the plot to question the legality of what's happening. That can be satisfying, especially given how much presence Del Toro and Brolin brought to the first film. But it also creates a challenge, because neither man was built to function as a conventional protagonist. Alejandro especially thrived on ambiguity. In the original you knew instantly he was dangerous, but the film withheld nearly everything else, making him more unsettling precisely because you had so little access to him. Now he's essentially the emotional core of the sequel. A very different job. Del Toro is skilled enough to make that shift feel almost seamless. He remains the strongest performance in the film, and crucially, Alejandro never turns soft. There's still something unnerving about him. Even in protective moments he can show real concern for Isabella while remaining fully capable of killing without hesitation. That contradiction is what makes the character work, especially once Isabella, initially just leverage to the men running the operation, becomes someone Alejandro genuinely has to reckon with as a person. The stretch in the desert where the two of them are simply forced to interact contains some of the film's best character work, and not because of some big emotional monologue. It's smaller than that. Isabella has no real reason to trust a man who helped orchestrate her nightmare, yet he's also the one keeping her alive. The film is at its best when it just sits inside that contradiction, and Del Toro never overplays it. You can see traces of Alejandro's history surfacing without the character becoming a fundamentally different person. He's still cold, still controlled, still dangerous. There's simply more visible humanity around the edges. Reactions to that development will vary. Humanizing a character whose power partly came from mystery inevitably costs something. The original could make Alejandro terrifying just by placing him in the background of a scene, while here, because he's carrying more of the emotional narrative, the film has to let the audience get closer, and the closer we get, the less mythic he becomes. He's still compelling, just no longer unknowable, and some of his behavior as a damaged killer discovering a protective instinct isn't exactly a novel arc. If you wanted him to become even more disturbing or mysterious, this will disappoint. If you wanted more of the man beneath the role, this delivers. Brolin faces a different challenge. Graver was already fairly transparent in the first film, a man completely comfortable with how dirty his job was, played with a physical ease that suggested toughness wasn't a performance for him anymore. That's why the moments of discomfort he shows here are interesting. The sequel gives him more of a moral conflict than expected, though not a full transformation. He isn't suddenly declaring the operation wrong, that would ring false, but there are points where you can see the orders from above pushing even him. Graver isn't a psychopath. He's someone who accepted an extremely ugly system because he believed he understood how to work within it. And there's a real difference between authorizing brutality and watching people he's used become disposable. Brolin plays those moments with restraint, a hesitation, a look rather than open emotion, which is the right choice. There's a fair criticism here, though. Some viewers will feel both Alejandro and Graver are being given more obvious consciences, sanding down edges that were sharper in the original. Maybe that's true. The first film never asked us to like these men, only to understand they existed within a system that found their methods useful. Soldado wants us more emotionally invested in them, which is a riskier move. They're still morally compromised, but the story now wants us to care what happens to them more directly, and without Kate around to consistently challenge them from the outside. That moral friction largely disappears. Isabella comes closest to filling that gap, but she can't function the same way. She's a teenager caught in a situation created entirely by armed adults with political agendas, without the information needed to serve as the operation's moral critic. Her role is more emotional than ethical, and Isabella Mona handles that well. The character easily could have become grating, either too attitude-driven or too helpless, but instead she reads as believably scared, angry, confused, and defensive, without being presented as some flawless innocent from the outset. That matters, because once things go wrong, It never feels like the film swapped in a different character just to manufacture sympathy. Her stubbornness carries through. She simply doesn't grasp the scale of what she's been pulled into. As she spends more time with Alejandro, the film becomes more emotionally grounded, not sentimental, thankfully, but grounded. Watching how each responds to the other, and the fact that neither belongs in anything resembling a normal protector and child dynamic, is what makes their scenes work. There's a slight discomfort even in the humanizing moments, which keeps things from feeling too tidy. Isabella also reveals something about Alejandro that the film never has to state outright. A man whose family was destroyed is now protecting the daughter of someone connected to that destruction. The situation itself carries the weight. No speech is required. That's Sheridan's character writing at its best in this film. Put people in morally contradictory positions and let their actions reveal the rest. The issue is that the movie doesn't always linger long enough. Plenty of viewers praise the character development in Soldado, and it's earned. Alejandro gains real layers, Graver gets genuine internal conflict, Isabella becomes more than a plot function. But there's also validity to the opposite complaint, that the film is too action-heavy to explore any of them as deeply as it could. Both can be true simultaneously. The characters do develop, the film simply doesn't dwell on it as often as it should. There's one later moment where a character finally drops their stone-faced composure, and it lands hard precisely because we've watched them suppress everything up to that point. A proof of how much more effective restraint can be than another round of exposition. The supporting cast is far less consistent. Matthew Modine and Catherine Keener exist mainly to represent the institutional layer above Graver, other people who authorize operations and then panic once those operations threaten political exposure. Functionally, they serve a purpose as characters. There isn't much substance. Keener in particular drew criticism in early reactions, with some calling her underused and others going further to call her miscast or distracting. I wouldn't say she damages the film, but it's easy to see why those scenes feel comparatively weak. Next to Delta and Brolin's presence, a character who mainly exists to hand down orders inevitably feels thin. That's a shame, because these government figures could have added real perspective. They're the ones making decisions from a distance, never getting shot at, never crossing the border themselves, capable of changing the entire mission with a single conversation. There's something genuinely cold and revealing in that setup, and the film does gesture toward it, but not with enough character development to leave a lasting impression. So the emotional weight of the film rests almost entirely on Alejandro, Graver, and Isabella, and whether Soldado works for you largely depends on accepting Alejandro as the one carrying that weight. This isn't Kate's story anymore. We're not watching an ordinary person discover how ugly the system is. We're watching people already embedded in that system discover they still have limits. That's arguably the most interesting idea the sequel explores. The first film asked what happens when someone with rules enters a lawless world. This one asks what happens when people who abandoned those rules long ago discover there are still things they can't comfortably do. That's why Alejandro protecting Isabella matters, and why Graver's hesitation matters. Not because either man becomes good, because they don't, and the film would collapse if it tried to sell that. It's because even inside this thoroughly amoral environment, the characters aren't entirely hollow. There's some line still buried in there, however far from where most people would draw it. The performances sell that idea. Delta never asks for forgiveness on Alejandro's behalf. Brolin never asks us to see Graver as heroic. Mona never turns Isabella into a saint. That restraint matters. These characters are more compelling when a little discomfort lingers around them. You can care about Alejandro and still remember what he's done, understand Graver's conflict without excusing him, feel for Isabella without ignoring where she comes from. That's the moral territory this film handles best. Messy, not always fully convincing, occasionally trying a bit too hard to make these men sympathetic, but when the character work lands, It gives Day of the Soldado something beyond another round of cartel gunfights. The filmmaking. The biggest question behind the camera was always going to be Stefano Sollima. Villeneuve gave the first film such a distinct identity that replacing him was never going to be an easy task. That movie didn't just look dark, it felt controlled in a way that made nearly every frame uncomfortable. Sollima inherits an unenviable job. Preserve enough of the mood to still feel like Sicario without simply imitating someone else's work. For the most part, he pulls it off, not flawlessly, but well. There are long stretches where you can feel the effort to preserve the original's visual language. The border at night, sprawling empty landscapes, vehicles crossing open desert, armed men set against vast, dusty spaces. Everything feels exposed, which matters as this world should never feel safe. Even when the characters technically have the upper hand, the locations themselves make them look vulnerable. A convoy full of heavily armed men can still feel small against a desert that dwarfs all of them, and the film gets that right. Comparisons between Dariusz Wolski's cinematography and Deakin's work are inevitable. And while it doesn't look identical, nor should it, I wouldn't call it a downgrade in any embarrassing sense. The border sequences have an earthy, dusty texture that suits the material. The nighttime photography stays moody without becoming unreadable, and the helicopter shots give the film scale without feeling like empty production value. They reinforce just how vast the territory is, how easily people can vanish into it, and how absurd the idea of fully controlling that landscape really is. There's a strong physical quality to how the film shoots roads specifically, which sounds like a strange thing to highlight, but roads matter enormously in these films. Cars approaching, waiting, getting boxed in, convoys crossing open land. A huge amount of tension comes purely from watching vehicles move through space. Something the first film understood brilliantly and something Soldado clearly grasps too. When the camera lingers on a convoy long enough, you start scanning every distant vehicle and roadside position, waiting for something to happen. Sometimes nothing does, and that waiting is itself part of the tension. Sollima handles that patience well. He doesn't cut constantly just because he can, the action stays legible. You understand where people are and where danger is coming from, which is a real advantage in a film with this much gunfire, since a lot of modern action collapses into noise, muzzle flashes, shaky cameras, rapid cuts, and you're left simply waiting to be told who won. Here, the geography usually holds together. You can follow an ambush, understand which side is exposed, and understand why someone can't simply walk away. That gives the action real weight, aided by editing that's tight without being frantic. Shots hold long enough for you to register a detail before cutting away, and that detail usually matters later. It's especially effective in the more suspenseful sequences, letting you actively scan the frame rather than passively absorb it, as something I always appreciate. The downside is that the film is almost too polished at times, and that's where some of the criticism has merit. The original had a rougher texture, not cheap looking, but raw enough that certain scenes felt like witnessed operations rather than staged sequences. Soldado feels more consciously designed, gorgeous lighting, strong compositions, tightly controlled action, an expensive-looking production. Oddly, that polish can make it feel slightly less dangerous, because you start noticing the craftsmanship, thinking that was a great shot instead of simply feeling uneasy, which is what happened more often in the original. It's a subtle distinction, and not really a criticism of Wolski's work specifically, more a comment on overall texture. The sequel sometimes seems aware of how cool and grim it looks, whereas the first film felt indifferent to whether you found it cool at all. It just wanted you uncomfortable. There are also stretches where the effort to preserve the original's darkness starts feeling a little forced. Everything is serious, everyone is bleak, nobody smiles. The landscapes are harsh, the score is ominous, the government is corrupt, the cartels are brutal. After a while, that unrelenting heaviness starts feeling almost self-conscious. as if the film is worried that 10 seconds of levity would break the illusion. The first movie's darkness felt like it emerged naturally from the story here. You can sometimes feel the mood being applied. That's where accusations of imitation stick, and there's some truth to them. Sollima clearly understands the palette, the pacing, the kind of wide shots this world calls for, how long to hold on a character before cutting away. But there are moments where the film's insistence on echoing Villeneuve becomes distracting in itself. That said, Sollima isn't simply copying the original. The sequel has a harder, more action-forward rhythm, more physically aggressive, which gives it its own personality, especially in the desert material. Alejandro and Isabella moving through open land, convoys pushing toward the border, characters disappearing into vast empty space. There's a nasty simplicity to it. Cover is limited, distance matters, and because the locations feel so exposed, every weapon suddenly feels more dangerous. No elaborate set design is needed. Just a few vehicles in the middle of nowhere, and the sense that there's nowhere to hide does the rest. The sound design contributes heavily to a gunfire lands with real physical weight rather than cartoonish exaggeration, and because the quiet scenes are genuinely quiet, the eruptions of sound hit harder. That contrast matters. The film doesn't stay loud constantly. It lets tension build through engines, footsteps, small environmental sounds. Then lets a scene erupt suddenly, which is far more effective than a soundtrack blaring at full volume for 2 hours straight. The score might be the film's strongest technical element. It plays less like traditional scoring and more like pressure itself, a low rumble sitting under scenes, almost mechanical, felt even when you're not consciously listening to it. That threatening quality suits the material perfectly. The music never tries to make violence exciting in a heroic sense. It's not signaling "here comes the cool part," it's signaling that something bad is coming, which gives even simple scenes a vehicle driving somewhere, someone waiting a countdown quality they wouldn't otherwise have. The score doesn't decorate the film, it stalks it, and combined with the editing, the low musical pressure, and the silence before gunfire, it makes certain sequences feel more intense than the plot around them probably earns, which I mean as a compliment. There are narrative beats in Soldado I don't fully buy in retrospect, but while they're playing out, the filmmaking is controlled enough that I'm fully with it in the moment. That's the power of strong direction and execution. They can make shaky connective tissue feel far sturdier than it actually is. The film also shows real visual restraint. There's plenty of ugliness on screen, but Sollima doesn't push the camera into every gruesome detail. When the violence is graphic, it's graphic for impact, not spectacle. That matters because the tone is already severe. Pushing everything to maximum intensity would exhaust the audience quickly. Instead, the film picks its moments, hits hard, backs off, and builds again, a rhythm that likely keeps it watchable even as the story gets messier. And visually, there's almost always something worth looking at. Earthy color palettes, dusty landscapes, military hardware, the contrast between sterile government spaces and open border territory, the way characters are framed inside vehicles. The craft is evident, the money is clearly on screen, but the production never turns glossy in the wrong way. It looks expensive without ever feeling inviting, and given the subject matter, that's exactly right. One technique I particularly liked is the use of distance, characters framed as small figures against a huge landscape, which creates a very different kind of tension than a close-up would. A close-up delivers emotion, distance delivers vulnerability, showing how isolated someone is and how far help would have to travel. Some of the film's best atmosphere comes from shots like these, and it's arguably where the sequel comes closest to the spirit of the original, not through copying specific scenes, but through understanding that environment alone can generate suspense. You don't always need dialogue or action. Sometimes the desert, a road, or a single approaching vehicle is enough. The film is at its best when it trusts that instinct. Where it struggles is when it seems too aware of what audiences loved about the first film and tries to summon that feeling on command. Several sequences clearly echo earlier Sicario beats: a tense road movement, controlled convoys, dangerous approaches, and some genuinely work. One sequence in particular reaches for the tension of the original's famous highway scene, and it's very good. But echoing a great scene invites direct comparison, and that comparison rarely favors the newer film. The original highway sequence built on unbearable patience. You knew violence was coming but not when, and it resolved almost instantly once it broke. The sequel can approximate that mood, but the audience now knows this franchise's language, knows how quickly things go wrong with vehicles, so some of the surprise is simply gone. That's not really a failure on Solima's part. Sequels inherit audience knowledge they can't erase, only work around, and he does a decent job of it. The film still finds ways to unsettle you, still creates moments where everyone seems one bad decision from dying, still conveys that nobody truly has control, just more firepower than whoever's standing next to them. The music, photography, and editing all reinforce that even when the script isn't operating at the same level as the original, the atmosphere usually is, or comes close enough to remain convincing. The dedication to J.A. Hansen also hangs over the film's musical identity. His work was such a defining part of the original's atmosphere that any sequel's score was inevitably going to be measured against it. Wisely, the new score doesn't try to reinvent the sound entirely. It keeps that sense of dread alive, using familiar musical ideas with restraint rather than constantly invoking them for nostalgia's sake, which is the right call, since nostalgia would be entirely the wrong feeling for this material. You shouldn't hear the score and think of the first film fondly. You should hear it and feel uneasy. That's the goal, and it's probably the best compliment I can give the technical side of Day of the Soldado. It understands exactly what kind of discomfort this world requires. It may be more polished, more visibly crafted, occasionally too deliberate in its darkness, but it still looks and sounds dangerous, and when the camera, editing, and score align, the film generates real tension even before a single shot is fired. That's genuinely difficult to pull off. The original still does it better. Villeneuve's version had a precision and natural dread this sequel never fully recaptures, but Solima doesn't embarrass himself trying. There are plenty of sequels where the missing director's absence is obvious within 5 minutes. Here, you notice the difference, but the film never feels like it's falling apart. That's a real achievement on its own. The action, if there's one place Sicario, Day of the Soldado clearly knows what it's doing. It's action, and not in the crowd-pleasing, slow-motion cool sense either. This isn't a film that wants a shootout to make you grin. The violence is meaner and faster than that. When people get shot, they usually just drop, with very little glamour attached. That bluntness is a big part of why the action works as well as it does. The film opens aggressively and never really pretends it's going to ease up. The suicide bombing sequence lands early. Then the story builds through cartel executions, cross-border operations, convoy attacks, ambushes, and close-range shootings. It's a punishing 2 hours, arguably too punishing for some viewers. There are moments that edge close to excessive, not because of non-stop gore but because the film offers almost no emotional distance from what's happening. When someone gets hit, you feel it, and nobody suddenly becomes an action hero. People panic, get trapped, and die quickly, often without the film pausing to let you process one death before the next problem arrives. That's where the violence lands hardest for me. It's not about body count, but about how little life seems to be worth in this world. Government agents, cartel members, and police all kill. Loyalties shift, orders change. Someone useful 1 minute becomes a liability the next. There's almost no stable moral ground, very much in keeping with Sicario's spirit. The difference is that the original made this brutality feel shocking because we were discovering it alongside Kate. Here, Everyone already understands the world, so the film has to generate impact differently, mainly through escalation, bigger operations, more direct violence, more situations where things can go catastrophically wrong in seconds. The convoy sequences are probably the strongest example. The film excels at making armed people in vehicles feel unsafe before anything even happens. You're watching the road, the mirrors, the escort, the distance between vehicles, uneasy well before the first shot is fired. That's good suspense. And when the ambush hits, it's controlled rather than chaotic. You can follow exactly what's happening, know where Graver's team is positioned, understand why they're exposed, because you understand the tactical situation. Every second carries more weight. It's not just loud gunfire, it's a problem you can track in real time. The action carries a clipped, professional quality. No unnecessary theatrics, no wasted dialogue, just people identifying threats and reacting, which makes the violence feel even colder. One particular execution sequence barely gives you time to brace for what's coming, and that's the film's tone in a nutshell. Decisions get made, people get removed, onto the next problem. That bluntness works far better here than exaggerated action would have. The gunfights themselves are shot with enough patience that they never become visually exhausting. There's movement, but nothing like the hyperactive, shaky cam style that makes action illegible. You can see what people are doing, gauge the distance between them, spot where cover exists and where it doesn't, and that clarity makes everything feel nastier, because losing track of an action scene tends to disengage you from it emotionally. Here, you usually understand exactly how dear a situation is. The desert sequences are particularly effective. Open space feels safe until you realize open space also means no cover, and suddenly every distant vehicle, ridge, or approaching figure becomes a threat. Some of these scenes generate more suspense out of people simply crossing empty land than most action films manage, with an entire building exploding. Much closer in spirit to the original's famous highway sequence, which inevitably looms in the back of viewers' minds. Soldado clearly reaches for that same tension in places as the waiting, the vehicles, the sense that violence is inevitable without knowing exactly when. Does it reach the same heights? For me, that highway scene was almost unbearable because of how long it delayed release, and how abruptly it ended once it broke. Soldado is more comfortable delivering the payoff at once, the action, whereas the original almost seemed reluctant that action had to happen at all. That's a subtle but important distinction. The sequel is more openly an action film, which changes the flavor of tension on offer. The original traded in dread, this one trades in anticipation. You know something bad is likely coming and you're waiting for the trigger. That can still be enormously effective, just different in feel. Pacing reflects that difference. For roughly the first two-thirds, the film moves extremely well, and some viewers may genuinely prefer this rhythm to the original's. It's more direct, with less time spent waiting for the story to reveal itself. The kidnapping leads quickly into the fake rescue, which leads into the return trip, which leads into betrayal. There's constant momentum, and I understand why some find this more engaging. The original could be deliberately slow, letting tension ferment. This one wants pressure, and once the operation starts, there's a persistent sense that the next crisis is already approaching. Even the quieter scenes, Alejandro and Isabella crossing the desert, Graver awaiting orders, migrants crossing the border, carry an undercurrent of threat even without action attached. The final third is where that momentum falters, not because the film becomes boring, but because the plot machinery becomes more visible. Certain scenes run longer than necessary. Developments start clearly repositioning characters for the ending, and the tension feels less organic because you can sense the film setting up its closing beats. That's disappointing given how confident the first two-thirds feel. There's a point where the story seems headed toward a hard, clean conclusion before veering into side paths that, while sometimes interesting, blunt the overall impact. That probably explains why pacing reactions are so split, as some viewers find the film nearly non-stop, Others feel it drags and both reactions make sense depending on which stretch you're discussing. The early and middle sections are tight, the final stretch is where things start to sag. Even so, the tension never fully disappears, partly because the film has already established that no one is truly safe. Once an audience learns a story is willing to kill without warning, every subsequent scene automatically carries more danger. A conversation in a car isn't just a conversation. A border crossing isn't just travel. An order from Graver's superiors isn't just information, it might determine who lives. That's where the film's moral brutality outweighs its physical violence. The ugliest moments aren't necessarily the bloodiest ones, but the way people get discussed as assets, problems, or loose ends. That language reveals everything. This is a system where morality has been replaced entirely by operational usefulness, which is exactly why calling Graver or Alejandro heroes never quite fits. Their protagonists are not the same thing. Graver works for the U.S. government, but that alone doesn't put him on some clean moral footing. The operation begins with kidnapping a teenager, which should tell you everything about where the line sits. Alejandro is even harder to categorize. His history explains, and even earns some sympathy for, his actions, but he remains capable of extreme violence, and the film never pretends otherwise, nor should it. What makes both characters interesting is that they seem to operate by personal limits rather than conventional ethics. Say things they'll do without flinching, until suddenly something triggers hesitation. That's more compelling than a standard revenge narrative, because the film isn't arguing these men are secretly good. That would be far too simple. It's suggesting that even people comfortably embedded in morally ugly systems can eventually hit something that feels wrong to them. That's a messier, more honest idea, and the film is at its best when it stays in that mess. Graver is entirely willing to destabilize cartels, stage a kidnapping, and manipulate people. But once orders shift toward covering up consequences rather than completing the mission, something visibly shifts in him. Alejandro follows a similar arc, fully capable of terrifying violence, but once Isabella stops being a target and becomes someone he has to protect, the moral equation changes. Not entirely, but enough to matter. That matters because without it, the film risks becoming emotionally hollow. There's only so much brutality an audience can absorb before it turns mechanical, and small flickers of conscience give the violence necessary contrast. Without them, every gunshot would eventually carry the same weight, and the film already flirts with that danger. There's simply so much violence that its shock value inevitably starts to fade. That's part of why some viewers find the sequel less disturbing than the original, despite arguably containing more explicit violence. Violence and disturbance aren't synonymous. The first film made you feel sick about the system itself. This one more often makes you tense about the next firefight. That's a real distinction. The sequel is bloodier. The original may still be more upsetting, largely because it spent more time making you question what you were watching, while Soldado is more comfortable simply letting you watch sometimes even enjoy the spectacle. The shootouts are exciting, the convoy attacks are exciting, the tactical choreography is exciting, and there's no point denying that. That creates a small but real contradiction. This is a story about morally horrifying behavior, told with filmmaking skilled enough to make the violence genuinely thrilling. Is the film aware of that tension? Mostly, yes. The score never turns these characters into superheroes. Deaths aren't celebrated, there are no victory poses, yet the action remains undeniably entertaining, which is the tension baked into the whole film. It condemns very little outright, it simply shows people doing terrible things with professional efficiency and lets the audience sit with that. Some will read that as honest moral ambiguity, others will see the film embracing the darkness a bit too eagerly, and I understand both readings. There are certainly moments where Soldado seems more interested in looking tough than interrogating what that toughness cost, something the original handled with more discipline. Still, the film isn't entirely empty on this front. The collapse of the government operation gives the violence a nasty irony. All this suffering exists because powerful people manufactured instability, and once that instability became inconvenient, the same system moved to erase the evidence of its own decisions. That reframes the body count. These aren't purely casualties of cartel violence, but casualties of policy, strategy, and someone far removed from the danger deciding that chaos was useful right up until it wasn't. That's darker than the gunfights themselves, and I wish the film leaned into it more, because that's where the action, politics, and morality genuinely intersect. When the film is simply shooting, it's a strong action movie. When you understand why everyone is shooting, it becomes more interesting, and when you register that some of the people giving the orders can simply walk away afterward, it becomes something uglier still. That's the detail that lingers, not any individual bullet or explosion, but the idea that this violence is being manufactured by people who may never personally experience its consequences. That's deeply in keeping with Sicario's original spirit. So even though Day of the Soldado is louder and more action-forward than its predecessor, there's still some of that underlying poison present. It's just easy to miss given how effective the action is. That might be the strangest compliment I can offer. There are stretches where the film is so skilled at being a brutal thriller that it nearly distracts from what it's trying to say about brutality itself. You're caught up in the tension, then a character makes a cold decision, and suddenly you remember this isn't meant to be pure entertainment. At its best, Soldado lives in that uncomfortable space, not constantly, but often enough to matter. The ending, the film's closing stretch, is where it starts to lose me somewhat, not entirely. There's still real tension in the characters and enough strong moments to keep you engaged. But somewhere in that final act, the movie stops racing toward a resolution and starts feeling like it's arranging pieces for a future installment. That's frustrating, because up to that point the story has built substantial pressure. The operation has collapsed. Alejandro and Isabel are cut off from Graver. The people who approved the mission are suddenly worried about exposure, and orders keep shifting. Everyone useful seen earlier can now become a liability. That should be the moment everything tightens. Instead, the film starts opening new doors, and you can feel it thinking beyond the movie you're actually watching. That's what makes the final act a bit awkward. Even though the danger itself remains effective, there are stretches near the end where you genuinely don't know who's going to survive, since the film has already proven it isn't sentimental about killing people. That gives real weight to the late sequences, at least initially, and nobody feels fully protected by plot armor. Alejandro's situation is especially tense, as the film has spent so long building him into a nearly indestructible operator. The guy who usually walks into other people's nightmares, that seeing him genuinely vulnerable grabs your attention immediately. The trouble is what follows. Without spelling it out entirely, some of the survival logic starts feeling like a stretch. The film has already asked for a fair amount of suspended disbelief, but the final 10 or 15 minutes push that further than the rest of the story really earns. Once that happens, the nature of the tension shifts. You stop asking how this character survives and start wondering how badly the film needs them for a sequel. Those are not the same question, and it's probably the ending's biggest weakness. You can see the franchise machinery working underneath. Whatever you thought of the first film's ending, it felt like an ending, uncomfortable, but final. You didn't leave thinking, well, that was mostly set up. Soldado is different. Its closing scene practically announces more story to come, and while I understand the instinct for continuation was always the plan, there's a real difference between planting a thread and turning the final scene into a trailer for the next chapter. This film edges close to that line, which weakens the impact of everything preceding it. Instead of sitting with the fallout of a failed operation, we're already being nudged to wonder where a particular character goes next. It's too soon. The story hasn't finished processing itself yet. That's also why the ending can feel oddly anticlimactic despite a lot technically happening. Violence, survival, hard decisions, consequences. None of it quite lands emotionally the way the build-up promised. The film seemed to be heading towards something harder and cleaner, then stretches past that natural stopping point. Some viewers genuinely liked this conclusion, even finding it poignant, and I understand the appeal. There's something thematically fitting about the idea that violence creates new cycles, that a relationship forged through violence might continue through violence, that the story doesn't simply stop once the official operation ends. That fits Sicario's worldview well. The border doesn't calm down because the credits roll, the cartels don't vanish, the government doesn't suddenly discover ethics. People keep moving through the same broken system, so an open ending makes sense thematically. My issue isn't really with that idea, it's with how transparently the film signals continuation. It feels calculated in the wrong way, especially given how strong the original's final reveal was. That film delivered a moment where everything about Alejandro, the mission, and the larger story suddenly snapped into focus. Not just a twist, but a full recontextualization of everything you'd watched. Soldado doesn't have an equivalent, and honestly, it probably couldn't. We already know Alejandro and Graver too well to repeat that trick. But the sequel doesn't replace that missing revelation with an equally strong thematic or emotional payoff of its own. It simply keeps moving forward. That's why the final act feels weaker than the first two-thirds. The film is strongest when driving forward with clear purpose, and once it starts preserving material for a future story, that purpose blurs, and you feel it in the pacing. Earlier, everything connects with momentum. The kidnapping leads to the fake rescue, which leads to the return trip, which leads to betrayal, which splits the characters apart. A constant forward motion into the next problem. Near the end, scenes start feeling less like consequences and more like setup, a subtle but noticeable shift. Certain arcs never really close, questions are left hanging, and rather than feeling haunting, that incompleteness sometimes just feels unfinished. That's where the whole planned trilogy approach becomes an issue. A middle installment can absolutely end on unresolved material. That's not inherently a problem. The real question is whether the film delivers enough satisfaction on its own terms, and Soldado sits right on that edge. For most of its runtime, yes. By the final scene, I'm less certain. There's a sense that the filmmakers are essentially asking you to trust that this will pay off later. And maybe a third film would retroactively sharpen the ending, but a film should still function on its own before that future chapter exists. It shouldn't need a sequel to complete its emotional math. That's genuinely frustrating, because Day of the Soldado is strong in enough areas that ending on something this calculated stands out as a letdown. The performances are strong, the action works, the atmosphere holds up, the technical craft is excellent, and there's real character material buried inside ideas about government power, morality, borders, and consequence. So when the ending starts feeling like franchise upkeep, it's noticeable. It lowers the ceiling of the whole film. Not enough to ruin it, but enough to keep it from closing the gap with the original. Final thoughts that, ultimately, sums up my overall reaction. A good film that constantly has to exist in the shadow of a great one, which is never an easy position. If Day of the Soldado had been released under a different title with different character names, I think audiences would be far more forgiving. They'd likely call it a tough, well-crafted border thriller with strong performances and genuinely effective action, and that would be a fair assessment. But it carries the Sicario name, which makes the comparison automatic, and the first film possessed something this sequel never fully recreates: mystery, dread, and a moral discomfort that ran deeper than its plot mechanics. It didn't merely depict violence, it made you uneasy about how effortlessly violence could calcify into policy. Soldado still carries pieces of that, sometimes very effectively, but it's more interested in functioning as a thriller, a bigger, harder, more direct one. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that ambition. There are moments where the sequel is arguably more immediately entertaining. The action is excellent, the pace is faster for most of the runtime, and Brolin and Del Toro are given far more space to work. If those elements were your favorite parts of the original, this delivers plenty of them, which is exactly why I wouldn't call it any kind of disaster. It isn't, not even close. There's too much craft, too much control, and too many sequences that execute exactly as intended. Even viewers who strongly disliked the story tend to praise the performances, cinematography, score, and action, which speaks to how solid the foundation really is. The problem lies in what's built on top of that foundation: a less disciplined story, messier politics, a less coherent moral perspective, a final act that strains credibility, and an ending more focused on future possibilities than present closure. Individually, these are small issues, but they accumulate. That said, I understand why some viewers consider this film more riveting than the original. If you prefer a faster, more aggressive action thriller, the appeal is obvious. This film rarely lets up, delivering brutal set pieces and unfiltered access to Alejandro and Graver without Kate's perspective softening anything. There's less mystery, but far more access, and that trade genuinely works depending on what you're looking for. For me, though, losing the mystery matters. The original made Alejandro fascinating precisely because he was so hard to read. This film makes him more human, which is interesting in its own right, but also considerably more familiar. Similarly, the first film used Kate to make the government's operation feel genuinely horrifying, while this one strips her away and asks us to simply live alongside the people running it. Also interesting, but it costs the story some of the moral friction that made the original so uncomfortable to sit with. The same applies to the violence. There's likely more of it here, possibly even more graphic, yet I don't think it's more disturbing overall. The original could make a single small moment linger with you for days. This film delivers many hard moments, some of which start to blur together. It's more violent but somehow less haunting, more ambitious but less focused, bigger but not necessarily deeper. And still I liked it quite a bit, actually. Not enough to place it beside the original, but enough that I'm glad it exists, which might sound like faint praise, but given how unnecessary this sequel initially seemed, it's a genuine compliment. This easily could have been a cynical cash grab riding on two returning actors. It isn't. There's real filmmaking craft here. Stefano Sollima takes the material seriously, Dariusz Wolski gives it a strong visual identity, the score sustains real tension throughout, Brolin and Del Toro still fully own these roles, and Isabella Mona gives the story an emotional anchor it badly needed. The action is controlled and genuinely brutal, and for a sequel that never strictly needed to exist, that's more than enough to make it worth watching.